Thank you, Spielberg. Well, good morning everybody, and thank you for being on time. It's unusual for people who live in New York. Well, you've all met Inga. I think you've probably been speaking to her or emailing her. Some of you even did our webinar. I think I met Rick over the webinar. And you'll be meeting Marion tomorrow, and Marion will be doing a session with you tomorrow afternoon. So I'll be here for today and tomorrow morning. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for making a great choice in your life. It's going to be hopefully a transformational time for you over the next 10 months. My personal journey with natural healing began about 30 years ago, and I was living in London, and I was extremely unhealthy at that time. I had been through many interesting things in my life, most of them unlawful, and I got into a position where my whole energy framework was totally dissipated. And I was staying with some friends in London, and their friends were living upstairs, and I had already started to experiment a little bit with like vegetarianism. In fact, I was eating, vegetarian food in London when I got there, and this was in the middle of winter, so I was eating things like bananas and fruit and trying to do the right thing, and it wasn't really working at all. And these folks upstairs introduced me to some very interesting, somewhat exotic foods that I'd never come across before. Things like a jar of miso was in the kitchen, and I had never come across miso before. In fact, I thought it was a form of Vegemite. You know, in New Zealand and Australia we have Vegemite. Have you come across that one? It's what we live off, right? It's a very dark paste, salty, savoury paste. So, and I got to talking to Keith, and he made like little comments like, "Oh, this miso is really yang, and it's really good for you." And I had never heard anybody use that term before. I had actually read it because I was interested in Eastern metaphysics. As a teenager, I was interested in things like the I Ching and meditation, etc. Basically, my interests as a teenager were punk rock music and meditation. And but I'd never come across the practical side of yin and yang. And he was involved with macrobiotics, and basically just explained a few things to me. That in London, it's very cold and damp, and you're existing off bananas, and bananas are actually very good if you're on a tropical island, right? Not in the, the winter time of London. And that immediately made sense to me instantly. You know when you get yourself into a point in life where the right bit of information comes in, you don't even have to think about it, it just sort of does something to you. It just spontaneously did something to me. And what I had noticed is my energy levels were very, very low. I'd ride a bike across town and I'll come back really exhausted at the end of the day. So I actually started to experiment with my diet. And I started to eat a little bit more cooked foods. I started to incorporate some grains, beans and vegetables, right? And I started to incorporate some of the very interesting foods that were propagated by the macrobiotic movement at the time. Things like some seaweeds, miso, tamari, etc. And I found that my whole energy framework just started to radically change after 2 or 3 weeks. I noticed that I could ride my bike and come home actually not tired but energized. I noticed that by giving up a lot of dairy food, when you're a vegetarian in the late 70s and 80s, you had a diet of dairy food and fruit and sugar. And I noticed that my energy was a lot more cleaner. I didn't sort of hold the pollution on my clothes from London. Like after, when you ride your bike for an hour or so, you'd come home and you'd smell the pollution. And I noticed that that wasn't clinging to me much. And then I noticed the psychological changes, because I had just arrived in London and I thought it was a very negative, horrible, I couldn't figure out why people would want to live there. And after like a month or two now, my whole attitude changed. I started to see London in a whole different light of day. And so I noticed that the psychological changes that I was experiencing was directly related to the quality, and you might argue the acid and alkaline, and the energy level of my food. How I was starting to make an adjustment to the cold winter of London, because basically I'd never been in such a heavy climate before. Growing up in New Zealand and Australia, we've got a very New Zealand can get pretty tough, but it's a fairly mild climate.